Many American workers have spent far too long unemployed, and we economists are supposed to be the experts on how the economy works and what needs to be done to keep it working. Obviously, we haven't been doing our job. It hasn't been economists, though, who've suffered for our failure. It's been workers who rely on a properly functioning labor market to provide for their families. It isn't just prolonged high unemployment that tells us that the labor market isn't functioning properly. We also know that because wages for the vast majority of workers have stagnated even as their productivity has increased. We know that because the employment to population ratio, which is the ratio of those actually in work to the total working age population, plummeted during the 2008 recession and still hasn't recovered, meaning that many people who would normally be working have chosen to do something else because they can't find a job and have been discouraged from looking, instead remaining in higher education, leaving the workforce to care for their families, or taking early retirement. That isn't because the generosity of unemployment benefits or other policy inducements not to work. If it were, then wages would have simultaneously increased in order to retain workers. We know the labor market isn't functioning properly because the quit rate, the rate at which employed workers leave their jobs to take new ones, has been in long-run decline, evidence that those who are lucky enough to have jobs cling to them tenaciously. In a healthy labor market, people change jobs as they work their way up, especially younger workers building a career. We also know that because the geographic mobility rate, the percentage of workers who change labor markets in a given time span, which was never all that high, has been in long-run decline, as my colleague mentioned. Not surprisingly, when simply having a job is a privilege, and the prospect of getting a new, better job is remote. Let me emphasize that fact is a symptom of labor market ill health, not its cause. We also know the labor market is unhealthy because of the increased prevalence of what economists call filtering down, when college-educated workers are taking jobs that previously didn't require a college degree, and high school-educated workers are left without the options they've traditionally had. What my colleague, Elizabeth Jacobs, who's here today, calls a cruel game of musical chairs. And we know that because labor's share of overall national income, the amount of labor multiplied by the wage as a percentage of GDP, has declined from 64% to 58% since the mid-1980s. That number may not sound significant, but it represents an enormous deterioration in the standing and relative well-being of those who have to work for their living relative to those who don't. During that same time period, the number of workers has increased by 50% and GDP has increased by 129%, while the median household's income from labor market activities only increased 1.5%. The country has become enormously richer over the past 35 years, but workers have not. So what does legislation to affect geographic mobility of unemployed workers have to do with labor market ill health generally? As I mentioned, geographic mobility has declined, and there is research dating back to 1992 that suggests the way that unemployment returns to normal after a recession is that the population migrates out of regions that are especially hard hit. As I said, the decline in mobility is a symptom of a weak labor market, not its cause, but it can still be enormously helpful to treat symptoms. While encouraging unemployed workers to move to opportunity-rich areas isn't a cure-all, there are still good reasons to support legislation that encourages mobility for the unemployed. We do know that local conditions are what matter for unemployed workers. Essentially, they conduct job searches in their own metropolitan area and those immediately bordering. When the seriousness of the recession is geographically correlated, workers get stuck in depressed regions. That is especially problematic for the young, who risk permanent labor market detachment. Chronic, geographically concentrated joblessness can cause a downward spiral for impacted neighborhoods, with consequences ranging from rising crime to failing schools to broken homes. Legislation to promote geographic mobility offers some measure of relief from the dangerous cycle of poverty that can result from the concentration of high, prolonged unemployment. One major issue for the unemployed, especially the young, is that it can be hard to even conduct a job search from afar. Thus, a legislative fix ought to provide funds for unemployed workers who don't yet, or who haven't yet been hired, to move to where there's a better chance of finding a job. That actually already happens more than many people realize. It's an especially promising route for the young who are unlucky enough to have their own social support system and network of contacts in a region with a weak labor market. In summary, legislation that contributes to the geographic mobility of unemployed workers victimized by the labor market's deterioration in recent years would remedy serial policy failures to do anything about their dire situation. I hope Congress will take note.